In the heart of Zawadi City, where the streets buzzed with life and the skyline stretched endlessly into the clouds, dreams were born and broken. This was a city of contrasts, bustling markets filled with the smell of roasting maize and sizzling meats, standing side by side with glittering skyscrapers that touched the heavens. It was a place where anyone could rise to the top if they were willing to fight for it. One man who fought and won was Queenie. Charismatic, smart and unstoppable, he wasn't just another businessman, he was a rising star. In his early 30s, he built a chain of trendy, must-visit restaurants, earning respect from everyone, from street vendors to the city's elite. He was the man who had it all: wealth, fame, and the love of his life. Leisha wasn't just his wife, she was the heart of their story. While Queenie chased success, Leisha chased something bigger: change. She was a compassionate social worker, dedicating her life to helping the forgotten people of Zawadi City, the hungry, the homeless, and the hopeless. People admired her just as much as they admired Queenie. Together, they were the city's golden couple, powerful, kind, and unstoppable. But not everyone celebrated their love. Ekwa, Queenie's older sister, saw things differently. She wasn't just his sibling. She had practically raised him after their parents died. To Ekwa, Queenie wasn't just her brother. He was her family, her responsibility. And in her eyes, Leisha had stolen him. Ekwa was a bold, successful woman in her own right, running an upscale boutique that dressed the city's most powerful women. But no amount of success could quiet the jealousy burning inside her. She believed Leisha had turned Queenie against her, and Ekwa wasn't the type of woman to forgive betrayal. What began as bitterness soon turned into hate. And hate? It's a dangerous thing, especially when family is involved. At first, Ekwa tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept into her heart whenever she saw Queenie with Leisha. She told herself it was normal. Her brother was newly married, and of course, he would spend more time with his wife. But as the weeks turned into months, that uneasy feeling grew into something heavier. Queenie wasn't just spending more time with Leisha, he seemed to be pulling away from his family altogether, and to Ekwa, that was unbearable. Ekwa had always been more than just a sister to Queenie. After their parents died, she stepped in, raising him like a son. She was the one who wiped his tears, helped him with his schoolwork, and worked day and night to make sure he had a future. She wasn't just his sister, she was his protector, his guide, his everything. And now, she felt like she was being replaced. Whenever she called Queenie, he was too busy to talk. Family dinners, which were once a regular thing, started happening less and less. And when he did show up, he always left early, rushing back to Leisha. Ekwa noticed the way he looked at his wife, like she was the only person in the world who mattered. It stung. She couldn't help but feel that Queenie didn't look at her like that anymore. Maybe he never had. The more Ekwa watched, the more convinced she became that this wasn't just love. To her, it was manipulation. She started to believe that Leisha wasn't as sweet and innocent as she appeared. Ekwa was sure that Leisha was pulling Queenie away on purpose, slowly turning him against his own family. She's clever, Ekwa thought bitterly. She plays the perfect wife, helping the poor and acting kind. But underneath that smile, she's dangerous. She wants him all to herself. Ekwa began to replay every moment in her head, twisting each one into proof that Leisha was controlling Queenie. She remembered how Queenie once called her every day to check on her, but now she was lucky to get a text. He used to visit her boutique to help with ideas and support her dreams. Now, he barely remembered she had a shop. Worst of all, Queenie stopped asking for her advice. He used to value her opinion above anyone else's, but now, Leisha seemed to be the only voice he listened to. In Ekwa's mind, this wasn't just a coincidence. She truly believed Leisha wanted to erase her from Queenie's life, leaving him with no one else to rely on. And it wasn't just about family anymore. Ekwa began to think Leisha's plan went deeper than that. She started to believe Leisha was after Queenie's success, his money, and his status. She doesn't love him, Ekwa told herself, her heart racing with anger. She loves what he can give her. She's using him, and he's too blinded by love to see it. The thoughts consumed her. The more she dwelled on it, the more her resentment grew. It was all she could think about. She would stay awake late into the night, staring at the ceiling, imagining Leisha convincing Queenie to cut ties with his family forever. She pictured her brother alone, betrayed and broken, after Leisha got everything she wanted and left him. Ekwa told herself she wasn't angry because she was jealous. No, she was angry because she loved her brother. She was doing this for him, to protect him. She had protected him all his life. Why should now be any different? She started to watch Lisha more closely, looking for any sign of fake kindness or hidden motives. Every smile looked forced to Ekwa now. Every generous act seemed calculated. When Lisha talked about her charity work, Ekwa no longer saw a woman who cared. She saw a woman trying to build a perfect image. Soon, Ekwa couldn't even stand the sound of Lisha's name. The bitterness inside her boiled into something more dangerous: hatred. She stole him from me, Ekwa thought. She stole my brother, my family, my life, and I'm not going to let her get away with it. In her mind, Lisha wasn't just a manipulative wife anymore. She was an enemy, and enemies had to be dealt with. Ekwa couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the jealousy, the feeling of being pushed aside, it all boiled inside her until it became something darker, something she couldn't control. In her heart, she still believed she was protecting Queenie. He couldn't see the truth, but she could. To Ekwa, Lisha wasn't a loving wife. She was a snake, wrapping herself around Queenie, squeezing tighter and tighter until he had nothing left. The more Ekwa thought about it, the more convinced she became that there was only one way to save her brother. Lisha had to go. At first, the thought felt wrong. She wasn't a bad person. She loved her family. But then she imagined Queenie years from now, broken, penniless, abandoned, after Lisha had taken everything from him and walked away. That image played in her head over and over again until it became unbearable. She had to stop it before it was too late. She wasn't doing this for herself. She was doing it for him. Ekwa knew this wasn't something she could handle on her own. She needed help, someone who knew how to make problems disappear without leaving a trace. That's when she thought of Dante. Everyone in Zawadi City had heard his name whispered in the shadows. He wasn't just a fixer, he was a ghost. People said he could make anyone vanish, and no one would ever find out who was behind it. He was dangerous, but Ekwa didn't care anymore. She was willing to do whatever it took. It wasn't hard to find him. People like Dante didn't hide. They waited for desperate people to come to them. She met him late one night in a rundown bar on the edge of the city, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. Dante wasn't what she expected. He wasn't big or intimidating. He was quiet, calm, too calm. His eyes felt like they could see right through her. Ekwa didn't waste time. She told him exactly what she wanted. It needed to look like an accident, a random mugging gone wrong. Zawadi City had enough street crime that no one would think twice. She offered him a hefty sum, more money than she had ever spent on anything in her life. Dante listened without saying a word. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. Ekwa didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "It'll be done." When Ekwa walked out of that bar, her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe, but she told herself it was the right thing to do. Lisha wasn't family. She was a problem, and problems needed to be solved. The next few days were unbearable. Every time Queenie mentioned Lisha's name, Ekwa forced a smile, knowing what was coming. She hated the waiting. She wanted it over with. She imagined the phone call, Queenie's broken voice telling her that Lisha was gone. She imagined holding him, comforting him, helping him pick up the pieces, just like she always had. But the call never came. Instead, something else happened. Something that made Ekwa's blood run cold. Dante showed up at her boutique. He wasn't supposed to do that. They weren't supposed to be seen together. He walked straight past her customers, ignoring the shocked looks, and stopped in front of her. His face was different now, serious, almost angry. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Ekwa hurried him into the back room, her heart racing. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. Dante didn't answer right away. He stared at her like he was deciding something. Then he spoke. "I followed her, watched her for days, and I'm telling you now, you're wrong about her." Ekwa's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" "She's not what you think," Dante said, his voice low and firm. "She's not after his money. She's not trying to hurt him. She loves him, and he loves her. I've seen it. I've seen her help people who can't give her anything back. I've seen her cry when she thinks no one's watching. Whatever you think she's doing to your brother, it's not real. You're making a mistake." Ekwa felt like the room was spinning. Her hands shook, but she clenched them into fists. "You don't know her like I do," she snapped. "Just do what I paid you for." Dante stared at her for a moment longer. Then he shook his head. "I'm not killing an innocent woman." He turned to leave, but before he walked out, he said one last thing. "You're the one hurting him, not her." The door slammed behind him, leaving Ekwa standing there shaking. Her plan was falling apart, but she wasn't done yet. If Dante wouldn't help her, She'd find someone else who would. Lisha wasn't going to win. Not this time. Dante wasn't a man who cared about right or wrong. At least that's what he told himself. He did his job, took his money, and moved on. But something about this job felt different. As he began watching Lisha, preparing to strike when the time was right, he couldn't shake an uneasy feeling in his chest. He had seen all kinds of people in his line of work. Cheaters, liars, thieves. But Lisha didn't fit the mold. At first, he followed her, because that's what he was paid to do. He watched her from a distance, studying her routines. He saw her leave the house early in the morning, long before Queenie woke up. She wasn't heading to fancy restaurants or shopping malls. She was going to the city's poorest neighborhoods. Dante stayed hidden in the shadows as he watched her hand out food and supplies to families who had nothing. He saw the way she talked to them, how she remembered their names and listened to their problems like they truly mattered. One day, he followed her to an old, run-down building on the edge of the city. He thought maybe this was where she kept her secrets, but instead, he found something else. It was an orphanage. The children ran to her as soon as they saw her, their faces lighting up with joy. Lisha wasn't just visiting, she was part of their lives. She played with them, laughed with them, and hugged them like they were her own. Dante watched as she knelt down to fix a little girl's hair, her voice soft and full of warmth. He couldn't look away. For the first time in a long time, Dante felt something unfamiliar, guilt. He had been hired to take this woman's life. But the more he watched, the more he realized she wasn't the monster Equa described. She wasn't manipulating Queenie or using him for his money. If anything, she was giving more of herself to the world than anyone he had ever met. He couldn't understand how Equa could hate someone like this. Dante started questioning everything. He remembered Equa's anger, the way her voice shook with bitterness when she hired him. It wasn't about saving Queenie. It was about getting rid of Lisha. And now, Dante wasn't sure he could go through with it. One night, after watching Lisha spend hours feeding the homeless, Dante made his decision. He couldn't stay silent anymore. He had to warn her. He waited for her to leave, following her through the quiet streets until she reached her car. Before she could get in, he stepped out of the shadows. Lisha froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't scream," Dante said calmly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Lisha stared at him, her voice shaky. "Who are you? What do you want?" Dante took a slow breath. "My name's Dante. Your sister-in-law hired me to kill you." Her face went pale. She stumbled back, gripping the car door for support. "Equa! No, she wouldn't do that." "She did," Dante said, his voice low but steady. "She thinks you're using Queenie. She thinks you're taking him away from her. She wants you gone, and she paid me to make sure that happens." Tears filled Lisha's eyes, but Dante wasn't finished. "I followed you for days," he continued. "I watched you. You're not who she says you are. I see that now. You love him, and you're a good person. You don't deserve this." Lisha's voice trembled. "Why are you telling me this?" Dante looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening. "Because I've done a lot of terrible things in my life, but killing you, that would be one too many. I can't do it. You need to leave, Lisha. Get out of Zawadi City. If Equa wants you gone this badly, she won't stop. I might not go through with it, but someone else will." Lisha shook her head, tears falling down her cheeks. "I can't leave Queenie. I love him. I won't run." Dante's expression hardened. "If you stay, you might not get a choice. Don't do this for yourself. Do it for him. If you die, it'll destroy him. You think Equa wins if you leave. Number she wins if you die." Lisha looked broken, torn between fear and love. Dante saw the pain in her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he felt his own heart ache. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a burner phone. "Take this," he said, handing it to her. "If you decide to run, call me. I'll help you disappear." Lisha stared at the phone for a moment before taking it with a trembling hand. Dante nodded once, then turned to leave, his voice low and final. "I hope you make the right choice, Lisha, because Equa isn't done yet." And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Lisha standing there, her heart pounding with fear, sadness, and a decision she never thought she'd have to make. Lisha sat in her car long after Dante disappeared into the night, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind was racing. Equa, the woman who hugged her on her wedding day, the woman who smiled at her during family dinners, had hired someone to kill her. The thought alone made her stomach turn. She couldn't believe it. But deep down, a part of her wasn't surprised. She had felt Equa's coldness, the way she looked through her instead of at her. Still, Lisha never imagined it would come to this. Tears burned her eyes, but she wiped them away. She didn't have time to break down. Queenie loved his sister more than anything. If he found out what Equa had done, it would shatter him. Lisha couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let him lose his sister, no matter how much Equa hated her. After a long night of thinking, Lisha made a decision. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide. She would face Equa, not with anger or hatred, but with hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could make Equa see that they didn't have to be enemies. Lisha called Equa the next morning, asking to meet in private. Equa sounded surprised, but agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, away from the busy streets of Zawadi City. Lisha arrived first, her hands trembling as she waited. When Equa walked in, dressed in her usual elegant style, she looked calm, too calm. Lisha took a deep breath. "Equa, I know everything," she said softly. "I know you hired someone to get rid of me." Her voice broke on the last words, but she pushed through. "Please, I'm not here to fight. I'm here because I love Queenie. I love him with everything I have. I would never hurt him or take him away from you. Can't we find a way to fix this? We're family." For a moment, Equa's expression flickered, something between shock and guilt, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a cold, bitter smile. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Is that what you're saying now?" Equa's voice was low and sharp. "You're making up stories to turn my brother against me. How convenient." Lisha's heart sank. "I'm not making this up," she said, her voice trembling. "Dante told me everything. He followed me. He saw the truth. He refused to hurt me because he knows I'm not who you think I am." Equa laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "So now you're dragging some street thug into this? How desperate are you, Lisha? You're twisting things, trying to paint me as the villain. I'm the one protecting Queenie from you." Lisha blinked back tears. "Protecting him from what? Loving me, being happy. Equa, I'm not your enemy. I never was. I never wanted to take him away from you. Can't you see that?" Equa's face hardened. "You've already taken him. He used to call me every day. He used to visit me, ask for my advice. Now he barely remembers I exist. Because of you. You stole him from me, and you want me to just sit back and accept it." Lisha's voice broke. "I didn't steal him. He loves you. He still loves you. He talks about you all the time. He looks up to you. You're his sister. Nothing will ever change that. But he's allowed to love me too." For a second, Equa's mask slipped. Pain flashed in her eyes, but it was gone before Lisha could hold on to it. Equa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You can play the victim all you want, Lisha," she said coldly, "but I see right through you. You're good at pretending. Pretending to care. Pretending to be the perfect wife. But I know what you really want, and I won't let you win." Lisha watched as Equa walked away, her heart aching. She had come hoping for peace, for understanding, but all she found was more hatred, more pain. As she sat there, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on her, Lisha made one final promise to herself. She wasn't going to give up. She loved Queenie, and no matter what Equa did, no matter how much she tried to break them, Lisha wasn't going anywhere. She would fight, not with anger, but with love, because in the end, love was the only thing that could save them all. Equa couldn't stop the anger burning inside her. Lisha was still standing, still smiling, still in Queenie's life, and now Dante had betrayed her too. She felt humiliated and powerless. In her mind, Lisha had won again, twisting everyone around her, playing the victim. Equa wasn't going to let that happen, not this time. The more she thought about it, the more her hatred grew. She convinced herself that Lisha wasn't just ruining her relationship with Queenie, she was ruining Queenie's life too. If Lisha stayed, Equa believed Queenie would lose everything, his business, his family, and eventually, himself. Equa couldn't let that happen. If Dante wasn't willing to finish the job, she knew someone who would. That's when she thought of Kofi. Kofi wasn't like Dante. He wasn't the type to back out because of a guilty conscience. He was known in neighboring cities as a ruthless, unstoppable hitman. People whispered his name in fear. He didn't ask questions. He just got the job done, no matter what. Equa had heard about him years ago, but never imagined she'd need someone like him. Now, she didn't care about the cost. She was ready to do whatever it took to get Lisha out of their lives for good. It wasn't easy to find Kofi. He didn't live in Zawadi City, and he didn't work for just anyone. But Equa was determined. After a few secret phone calls and meeting with the right people, she finally got what she wanted, a meeting with Kofi himself. They met in an old warehouse on the edge of the city, far away from prying eyes. When Ekwa saw him, a chill ran down her spine. Kofi wasn't a large man, but there was something terrifying about him. His eyes were cold and empty, like he'd seen too much and felt nothing anymore. Ekwa tried to hide her fear as she spoke. "I need someone gone," she said firmly. "For good." Kofi tilted his head, studying her. His voice was low and calm. "People don't come to me for easy things. This isn't a game, lady. Once it's done, there's no going back." Ekwa's voice didn't waver. "I know. I don't want her to survive. No mistakes this time." Kofi leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "Who is she?" "Lisha. My brother's wife. She's poisoning him, taking him away from his family. She's dangerous." Ekwa's voice shook with anger. "She needs to disappear." Kofi was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It'll cost you. Half now, half when it's done." Ekwa didn't hesitate. She had brought a thick envelope of cash, more money than she'd ever given anyone. She handed it to him, her hands steady. "Just make sure it's done right. Quiet. No mistakes." Kofi took the envelope and tucked it into his jacket without even looking at it. He stepped closer to Ekwa, his voice low and final. "It'll be clean. Quick. No one will trace it back to you," he promised. "She won't see it coming." Ekwa felt a twisted sense of relief. It was finally happening. This time, Lisha wouldn't escape. This time, Queenie would be free. Free from her lies. Free to come back to his real family. As she left the warehouse, Ekwa felt a strange calm wash over her. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting her brother. But deep down, a small voice whispered something she refused to hear. This wasn't about Queenie anymore. It was about her. And now, there was no turning back. Dante couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying everything. Lisha's kindness, Ekwa's hatred, and his own role in the mess. He had taken dirty jobs before, but this one felt different. He had gotten too close. And for the first time, he cared. Lisha didn't deserve to die. He knew that. But now, with Kofi involved, things were out of control. Kofi wasn't like him. Kofi wouldn't hesitate. The guilt was eating him alive. He couldn't stand by and let it happen. He had to stop it, even if it meant betraying Ekwa. He told himself it wasn't really betrayal. She had crossed a line. He wasn't saving Lisha for Ekwa's sake. He was saving her because it was the right thing to do. Dante made his decision. He wasn't just going to warn Lisha again. This time, he was going straight to Queenie. Tracking Queenie down wasn't hard. He found him at one of his restaurants, overseeing the evening rush. Queenie looked surprised to see him, but greeted him with his usual warmth. He didn't know who Dante really was. Not yet. "We need to talk," Dante said, his voice low and serious. "It's about Lisha." And Ekwa Queenie's smile faded. He led Dante to his office, sensing something was wrong. As soon as the door closed, Dante laid it all out. The job Ekwa had hired him for, why he backed out, and how she found Kofi to finish what he wouldn't. Queenie stared at him, frozen. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You're lying." "I'm not." Dante reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He played a recording, Ekwa's voice, clear and cold, giving him instructions to make Lisha's death look like an accident. He showed Queenie screenshots of bank transfers and messages from Ekwa. The evidence was undeniable. Queenie's face went pale. He sat down slowly, his hands shaking. "She's my sister," he said, his voice cracking. "Why would she do this? Why would she hate Lisha so much?" Dante's voice softened. "She thinks Lisha's taking you away from her. She's convinced herself she's protecting you. But this isn't protection. It's obsession." Queenie buried his face in his hands. He couldn't believe it. The sister who had raised him after their parents died, the one who had always been his biggest supporter, wanted his wife dead. His heart felt like it was being torn in two. After a moment of silence, Queenie looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "Lisha doesn't know, does she?" Dante shook his head. "She knows Ekwa tried before, but she doesn't know about Kofi." Queenie stood up, his voice steady now. "Then we stop him. I'm not letting anyone touch my wife. Not Kofi, not Ekwa, no one." For the first time that night, Dante felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't too late after all. Queenie knew he had no time to waste. Kofi was dangerous, and Lisha's life was hanging by a thread. He couldn't afford to wait and hope things got better. He had to end this himself. His heart ached knowing his sister was behind it all, but protecting Lisha came first. He made a plan, one that would stop Kofi and uncover the truth once and for all. He told Lisha he had to leave for a sudden business trip. It broke him to see the worry in her eyes, but he reassured her everything would be fine. She didn't know this was part of the plan. He needed Kofi to believe she was alone and vulnerable. Behind the scenes, Queenie wasn't leaving at all. He called in trusted security, men he knew wouldn't hesitate to protect Leisha. He stationed them around the house, hidden but ready. Every corner of the property was covered. Cameras were set up to record everything. The trap was set. Now, they waited. Hours passed. The house was quiet, and Leisha, believing she was truly alone, went about her evening. Queenie watched from a hidden van nearby, his heart racing with every minute. He hated putting her through this, but it was the only way. Finally, Kofi showed up. He moved like a shadow, slipping through the back entrance. He was fast, quiet, and deadly, exactly as Ekua had promised. But Queenie was faster. The moment Kofi stepped inside, the lights blazed on, blinding him. Security swarmed in from every direction. Kofi lunged for his weapon, but they were too quick. He was slammed to the ground, his hands pinned behind him. Queenie stepped out from his hiding place, his eyes burning with anger. "It's over, Kofi." Kofi stared up at him, breathing hard. For a second, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even respect. But it didn't matter. He was caught. Leisha ran to Queenie, confused and scared. He held her tightly, whispering that it was over now, that she was safe. She didn't ask questions. She just clung to him, tears in her eyes. Queenie looked down at Kofi one last time. "You're going to tell me everything, and then I'm going to deal with my sister." Queenie sat across from Ekwa in her boutique, his heart heavy with pain. He had loved his sister his entire life, trusted her more than anyone. Now, that trust was shattered. He placed the evidence, the recordings, the bank transfers, everything, on the table between them. Ekwa stared at it in silence, her face pale. "Why, Ekwa?" Queenie's voice trembled, his eyes filled with hurt. "Why would you do this? Why would you try to kill my wife?" Ekwa looked away, her eyes glassy. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I thought I was saving you." Queenie's fists clenched. "Saving me? From what? Leisha loves me. She's never done anything but support me. You tried to take her away from me forever. How could you?" Tears spilled down Ekwa's cheeks. "I was scared, Queenie. After she came into your life, everything changed. You stopped calling me. You stopped visiting. It felt like I lost you. I thought she was controlling you, pulling you away from me. I hated her for it." Queenie's voice softened, but the pain didn't leave his eyes. "You didn't lose me, Ekwa. I got married. That didn't mean I stopped loving you. You're my sister. You'll always be my sister. But you tried to destroy the woman I love. You nearly destroyed me too." Ekwa broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. "I was wrong. I see that now. I was so blinded by jealousy. I convinced myself it was for your own good. I didn't realize how far I had fallen, how much damage I was causing. I'm so sorry, Queenie. I didn't want to lose you." Queenie stared at her for a long moment, his heart torn in two. He saw the sister he grew up with, the one who raised him when their parents died, who protected him from bullies, who always believed in him. But now he also saw a woman broken by her own bitterness, someone who had nearly destroyed his happiness. "I'll always love you, Ekwa," he said quietly, "but I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Ekwa sobbed harder, knowing she had lost something she might never get back. The weight of her choices finally crashed down on her, and this time, there was no escaping it. The day Ekwa was arrested was one Queenie would never forget. He watched in silence as the police led his sister away, her wrists in handcuffs, tears streaming down her face. She didn't fight or argue. She knew there was no point. The truth was out, and there was no undoing what she had done. Leisha stood beside Queenie, holding his hand tightly. Despite everything Ekwa had put her through, Leisha couldn't find it in her heart to hate her. She saw the pain in Ekwa's eyes and felt only sadness. Leisha knew Ekwa's actions came from a twisted place of love and fear, even if they were unforgivable. When the trial began, the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the bank transfers, and Kofi's testimony all painted a clear picture. Ekwa had tried to have Leisha killed, not once, but twice. The courtroom was filled with whispers and shocked gasps as the truth unraveled. Queenie sat through it all, his heart breaking a little more with each word. But Leisha did something no one expected. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't ask for punishment or revenge. She asked for mercy. "She's his sister," Leisha told the court, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "She acted out of fear and jealousy, not true malice. I don't excuse what she did, but I understand it. I don't want this family to be broken forever. I forgive her, Her words moved the courtroom, but the law couldn't ignore the seriousness of the crime. Ekwa was sentenced to prison for conspiracy to commit murder. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was long enough to leave a deep scar on the family. Queenie visited her once before she was transferred to a distant prison. Their conversation was short and filled with tears. He loved her, but trust was broken, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. Life after the trial wasn't easy. Queenie and Leisha tried to move forward, but the shadow of what happened lingered. Family gatherings felt emptier, quieter. The warmth they once shared had been replaced by something colder, something broken. Still, they held on to each other, determined to heal. Leisha's forgiveness gave them a glimmer of hope. Maybe one day, even Ekua could find redemption, but that day was still far away. After everything they had been through, Queenie and Leisha knew they couldn't let the pain define them. The betrayal, fear, and heartbreak left scars, but they refused to let those scars turn into bitterness. Instead, they focused on healing and rebuilding their lives together. Queenie, once focused on growing his business empire, found a new purpose alongside Leisha. They decided to use their painful experience to help others. Together, they started a foundation dedicated to preventing family conflicts and promoting forgiveness. They wanted to help families torn apart by jealousy, anger, or betrayal, just like theirs had been. Leisha became the heart of the foundation, organizing events, offering counseling, and speaking to families who were struggling. Queenie used his business connections to fund the project, ensuring they reached as many people as possible. Their work became more than a mission. It became a source of healing for them too. Every life they touched reminded them that something good could come from their suffering. Even as they moved forward, Queenie couldn't forget Ekwa. He missed his sister, the woman who had once protected him with all her heart. The betrayal still stung, but he couldn't stop hoping she would find her way back to him, not as the bitter, jealous woman she became, but as the loving sister he once knew. In prison, Ekwa was forced to face the truth. The anger that once fueled her now felt hollow. Alone in her cell, she had nothing but time to reflect on her actions. She hated the person she had become. She realized her jealousy had poisoned her love for Queenie, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Leisha surprised her by sending letters, kind, forgiving words that Ekwa didn't believe she deserved. For a long time, Ekwa couldn't even read them, but one day, she did. Leisha's compassion broke through her shame. Slowly, Ekwa began to change. She sought counseling in prison, determined to become a better version of herself, someone worthy of her brother's love again. Queenie and Leisha didn't know if their family would ever fully heal, but they chose to believe in hope, forgiveness, and second chances. Their love grew stronger, their foundation thrived, and somewhere, Ekwa was on her own path to redemption. Healing wasn't easy, but they faced it one day at a time, together.